Good afternoon. I'm Matthew Santaracco, a professor of classics here at NYU and the director of our Center for Ancient Studies. As those of you know who have participated in our activities, the center was founded 25 years ago within the Faculty of Arts and Science to promote the interdisciplinary and cross-cultural study of the past. We do this by encouraging faculty and students in a variety of arts and science departments and programs, as well as in other schools and institutes of the university, to collaborate with one another through curriculum, research projects, occasional publications, and international study grants for undergraduate and graduate students. We also reach out to the larger scholarly community and to the general public. Thus, the Aquila Theater is company in residence at the center. In addition, we have sponsored through the Faculty Resource Network a series of summer and winter seminars that bring together faculty from colleges across the country to study aspects of the ancient world. Finally, we reach an even larger public through our endowed annual conferences, many of which explore areas where ancient and modern experience intersect, and where the perspectives offered by the past can help us analyze, understand, and perhaps even in some cases respond to contemporary issues and contemporary challenges. But we're certainly at a challenging moment right now. A bit over a year ago, when the pandemic necessitated a sudden pivot to online work, the programming of our center was initially interrupted. But we soon returned to our activities, but in a virtual format. Thus, we inaugurated a series of webinars organized around the general rubric, Topics for Challenging Times, Ancient Perspectives on Modern Issues. Our first webinar, in anticipation of the US presidential election, featured a conversation between two distinguished scholars, a classicist and an American political scientist, on the topic of elections, ancient and modern. We then focused on monuments and memory. As our history is being contested and the monuments commemorating it are being removed, defaced, or defended, a panel of art historians and archaeologists provided useful context from ancient Egypt, Greece, and Rome about what and how we choose to remember and why and how we choose to forget. Another event that took that conversation forward a bit further by looking at the field of ancient studies itself. At a time when societies and institutions are grappling with an ongoing legacy of racism, the disciplines that comprise the field of ancient studies are re-examining their history and their current practices in the context of social justice. In that context, we assembled a panel to examine what we called applied ancient studies, how the field is reaching out beyond its traditional constituencies to become a more relevant and inclusive community. For example, through programs that engage refugees, military veterans, the incarcerated, and indigenous populations. And we are taking this conversation further still over the summer, when we will be inaugurating a webinar series on emerging scholars. Through a call for proposals, we are identifying graduate students whose cutting-edge research has the potential to move the study of antiquity forward, either by addressing new topics or by using new methodologies. And we also look forward to showcasing in this series scholars from groups that have been or still are underrepresented in the field or in the academy as a whole. For the coming year, we will continue this series of webinars on topics for challenging times, but we'll also be hosting two major conferences. The first in October will focus on prehistories of the job between the Roman Republic and Empire. And the second in March will focus on archaeological discoveries at Caesarea under the auspices of the Rothschild Foundation. And looking forward even a bit further, the center will be hosting a major international conference on ancient emotions, a comparative approach, in the fall of 2022. If you're interested in attending any of the center's events, please check out our website. The website also contains an up-to-date calendar of all lectures, exhibitions, and conferences at NYU that are related to antiquity. And if you would like to be put on our mailing list, I encourage you to sign up on the website as well. But now, to focus on today's event. One topic for academic programming across the academy this past year has been, not surprisingly, the pandemic itself. In our field, the number of scholarly publications and conferences that have focused on ancient plagues has been impressive. And there has also been a proliferation of popular articles and op-eds on the relevance of that ancient experience to our own. In this connection, I'd like to take this opportunity to invite everyone who's on this webinar to visit the online exhibition at NYU's Institute for the Study of the Ancient World. It is entitled The Empire's Physician: Prosperity, Plague, and Healing in Ancient Rome. Well, our panel today will open up this conversation in several different directions. Kyle Harper will discuss pandemics from the perspective of an historian whose work draws on the most recent scientific evidence. Callaway Scott will open up the conversation to larger questions of health and disease. And Hunter Gardner will explore discourses of plague. Our speakers will, of course, focus on antiquity, but will also, as appropriate, take their discussions forward to other times and other cultures. The format of today's panel will be as follows. Professor Callaway Scott, whom I will introduce in greater detail in a moment, will provide introductory remarks to frame the conversation, and will also introduce the presenters and serve as moderator. All of this in addition to being himself one of the presenters. After all three panelists have spoken, we hope to have a more informal discussion among the panelists. But we also want everyone who is attending this event to have the opportunity to ask questions. To do this, please use the Zoom webinar's Q&A function, which appears at the bottom of your screen. Just type in your questions at any point during the event, and the moderator and speakers will get to as many of them as possible. I want to take this opportunity to thank my colleague, Maura Pollard, our center's program administrator, who has set up this webinar and worked tirelessly on all aspects of today's program. I also want to thank our very distinguished panel, and of course, all of you who have set aside time this afternoon to participate in this event. And now I'd like to introduce Professor Callaway Brewster Scott, who is Assistant Professor of Classics at the University of Cincinnati. His research is informed by an interest in the entanglements of science and society. Inspired in turn by turns in medical history and medical anthropology, his current book project examines the ways in which health and disease are conceptualized and experienced in antiquity as biological, social, and political phenomena. It makes the case that health furnished a key conceptual tool for performing interpersonal relations and civic cohesion alike, taking as evidence medical treatises, material culture, and our knowledge of Greek healing cults. Among other things, he is interested in the historical uses and abuses of the Hippocratic corpus, in cultural perceptions of heredity, and in divination, epistemology, and institutionalism in the Mediterranean. He has published in leading journals and is a regular contributor to Synapsis, a public-facing project in support of the medical humanities. He also serves as a board member of the Society for Ancient Medicine and Pharmacology. As a point of personal privilege, I would like to note that Professor Scott received his PhD from NYU, where he also was on our faculty and was one of our most brilliant scholars, successful teachers, and a valued colleague. We're so delighted to welcome him back today. And at this point, I will turn the podium over to you, Callaway.
So much, Matthew, for that extremely kind introduction. It's a real pleasure to be back, albeit virtually at my alma mater. It's really exciting. Thanks to Maura and the Center for Ancient Studies for organizing and inviting me to two exceptional scholars, Kyle Harper and Hunter Gardner. I'm going to just sort of give brief bios and then some very brief introductory remarks to lead us in. So Kyle Harper is professor of classics and letters, as well as the provost emeritus and senior advisor to the president at his alma mater, the University of Oklahoma. A scholar of economic and environmental history, Harper is the author of 4 books: Slavery in the Late Roman World, which was awarded the James Henry Breasted Prize and then From Shame to Sin, The Christian Transformation of Sexual Morality, which received the Award for Excellence in Historical Studies from the American Academy of Religion, and The Fate of Rome, Climate, Disease, and the End of Empire, which has been translated into an amazing 12 languages. His 4th book, Plagues Upon the Earth, Disease in the Course of Human History, is a study of humanity's long and distinctive relationship with infectious disease. Global in scale and spanning from chimpanzees to COVID-19, the book will appear from Princeton University Press in 2021, so keep an eye out for that. Hunter Gardner is a professor of classics and comparative literature at the University of South Carolina. Dr. Gardner's latest book, Pestilence in the Body Politic in Latin Literature, OUP 2019, looks to Roman epic poets writing in the late Republic and early Principate as significant contributors to depictions of contagion and epidemic disease. In addition to working in the field of Latin literature, Dr. Gardner regularly teaches and publishes in the area of reception studies. She's co-edited a collection of essays on adaptations of the Odysseus myth in various media, Odyssean Identities in Modern Cultures, The Journey Home. She also teaches a course on the reception of Greco-Roman antiquity in cinema and popular culture. She's published numerous articles on that topic and is currently editing a collection entitled Ancient Epic in Film and Television, due out late this year. So keep your eyes open for that as well. Who possibly better than to discuss today's theme, pandemics in antiquity and beyond, and from such different and complementary angles. I'll try to keep these comments pretty brief. For my part, when I started teaching courses on ancient medicine in the Greco-Roman world several years ago, although after this year, it feels considerably longer, I started the class with some very simple questions. I asked my students, who had heard of World War I? Cue bemused eye rolls and raised hands. But then I asked who had heard of the Spanish flu. Crickets. Of course, in the age of COVID, we all have now been well exposed or re-exposed to the history of the Spanish flu, the greatest lethality event of American history, one which took the lives of some 675,000 Americans while overlapping World War I. Why then had students never heard of one, but all had obviously heard of the other? What does that reveal to us about our priorities as a society? What does it tell us about the way our collective memories work? And why does it seem like we only reach back to events like the Spanish flu or the Black Death, or even the Plague of Athens when confronted by some new horror? This evening, by putting the science, which is clarifying the past, into dialogue with the history of medicine and literary studies, we hope not perhaps so much to answer these questions, but rather to highlight the importance of asking them and continuing to do so even when this particular pandemic ebbs. This is because, as we all know too painfully well now, illness, pandemic or individual, is not a matter simply of medical or biological or ecological affairs. It attaches to everything. It infiltrates political institutions. It exposes social, economic, racial, and global stratifications. It infects cultural production from film to literature and music. To reflect on pandemic, both past and present, is to try to see the world whole, and what could be more humanistic. With that, I think we can turn it over to Kyle. Thank you so much.
Thanks for the kind introduction. It's a privilege to share the panel with you and with Hunter. I want to thank Matthew and the Center for inviting me and for putting this together, and the audience for being here to talk about the history of pandemics and what we can learn from antiquity. And I thought we'd start around the dinner table with the kind of conversation that you might hear among the educated elite of the Roman Empire. And We can do that by reading the texts of Plutarch, Table Talk, written around the beginning of the 2nd century, and the kind of question that he would ask, such as whether it is possible for new diseases to come into being and from what causes. And this is a wonderful discussion that sees both sides of the question entertained. On one side, a physician like Philo says yes, because a disease like elephantiasis, which is more or less probably corresponds to the infectious disease that we know as leprosy, has only been known for a short time. And others, in fact, Plutarch says the majority were rather inclined to the second hypothesis, because it put most of the blame on humanity for causing new diseases. And rather than imagining that diseases came from what he calls different specific seeds of disease, the ways that humans lived caused new diseases. And the ancient authorities believed that nature was not at all given to innovation in these matters. So you can see this interesting debate about new diseases already in the Roman Empire. And unfortunately, as COVID-19 has constantly reminded us, we know that nature is very given to innovations in such matters, thanks to the mechanism that we know as evolution. Biological evolution is the driving force in the history of infectious disease. And Plutarch lived at a very interesting moment in the history of infectious disease, and is an important and interesting witness to the role of disease in the Roman world. But as we move back into the ancient world, I think it's always helpful to remind ourselves of how different the world that we inhabit really is. The modern world, relative to the ancient world, is both healthy and wealthy. And here you see the dots along the top are modern countries, plotted by life expectancy at birth. You can see even in the very lowest countries with the lowest life expectancy, it's still in the mid 50s, ranging into the mid 80s. And you can see that per capita incomes range from around $1,000 per capita per year to nearly 100,000 per capita per year. You can see plotted below that the 5 crosses as late as 1820. These are estimates for each of the 5 major inhabited continents for mortality and wealth. So even in the healthiest and wealthiest countries, only 200 years ago, life expectancies were still in the mid 30s, and per capita incomes very little over $1,000 per year. So when we go back to the ancient world, we're entering a world where life expectancy is relatively low and where incomes are much closer on average to the subsistence level. So in the ancient world, infectious disease would have accounted for the vast majority of all deaths at all times, even in years when there wasn't epidemic mortality. Most people, judging by late pre-modern societies, we would estimate 2/3 to 3/4 of all people at all times die of infectious causes. We live in a world where most deaths are due to cancer and organ diseases, although COVID-19 has reminded us of the power of epidemic mortality. I want to make the case today for a kind of history that draws on the natural sciences, and to try and map out some of the ways that people who are interested in the history of ancient societies can draw from work that's being done in the natural sciences. And I'll start by simply offering a few biological basics about infectious disease. So infectious disease is a state of impaired health that's caused by a microbiological invader. Our microbes that cause disease come from many different biological taxa or categories, including viruses, like the agents of diseases like COVID-19, AIDS, yellow fever, smallpox, measles, and so on. Bacteria that cause diseases from plague to shigellosis to typhus. Protozoa cause diseases like malaria, and helminths or worms that cause numerous important, particularly chronic infectious diseases. So infectious diseases can be caused by different agents. There's some diseases caused by fungi as well, but they're of less significance and usually only among people who already have compromised immune systems. So most human infectious diseases are caused by agents in these different taxa. Infectious diseases are transmitted from host to host via different routes, sometimes via the skin, sometimes via sex, although there are actually in number not a huge quantity of infectious diseases that are sexually transmitted. Most important human infectious diseases are vector-borne, fecal, oral, or transmitted via the respiratory route, like COVID-19. Pathogens are adapted to a host. Sometimes it's us, sometimes it's not us, sometimes it's sort of us. all of our diseases at least started as pathogens of wild animals and adapted to humans either directly or via the intermediary of our domesticated animals. And some pathogens have become so adapted to humans that they exclusively infect human beings as their host. So with those kind of basics in the background, I think I want to say a few things about what disease history is, can, or should be. Disease history is the study of human infectious diseases, and I think it works particularly well on very big time frames, deep history with large time scales, and sometimes works even better at bigger time scales than smaller ones. It's certainly a kind of history that works well at larger spatial scales. Disease history is particularly, I think, congruent with global history because diseases, infectious diseases, are geographically structured, but don't recognize or respect human political boundaries. And really to understand disease processes and historical perspective requires planetary scales. But I think that nevertheless, none of this eradicates the need for kinds of history that still zoom in. And so I'm championing a kind of history that both zooms in and zooms out. To give two examples, one of the plagues that occurs in the Roman Empire a few generations after Plutarch is known as the Antonine Plague. We don't know the biological agent of it with certainty. Its impact and nature are much debated. One of the, I think, important pieces of evidence for its impact comes from changes in the rate of rent charged on fields, on arable agricultural fields in Egypt. And it turns out that understanding this requires understanding how to price in fallow land in rent contracts from Greek language papyri of the early Roman Empire. So very much a kind of zooming in that ultimately speaks to really big questions about whether or not this pandemic was demographically significant. Another example is the recent publication that I think is an absolute stunning model of historical work that's a close reading of an important early medieval witness, Gregory of Tours, who's one of our most important witnesses for the first plague pandemic, for the plague of Justinian and its aftermath in particularly Gaul and parts of Italy. And Mike McCormick offers just a brilliant close reading of Gregory's language and his perspectives on the history of disease in his world. So I think disease history can both zoom in and zoom out. I think it works best too as a kind of interdisciplinary history that's all at the same time, humanities, social sciences, and natural sciences. In my own personal experience, sometimes this makes humanists nervous. I understand that, but wish it wouldn't. I love the programmatic statement of John McNeill that people made their own history, but they didn't make it as they pleased because ecology would not let them, paraphrasing Marx. I think this is a kind of history in which human agency is limited because diseases mattered. They shaped and constrained human agencies. But nevertheless, humans shape the ecology of disease. They shape pathogen evolution. So it's not a one-sided or one-directional kind of history. And it's a kind of history, I think, that can situate human agency vis-a-vis infectious disease and help us try and trace the changing nature of humanity's control or lack thereof over infectious disease over time. I think that historians and scientists need each other because human diseases are distinctly a product of our history. And so if human history we imagine as the long-term cumulative changes in culture and technology, then we can see that human diseases, the particular pool of diseases that human beings have suffered and do suffer, is a product of this history. And in particular, the way that technology and technological change allows humans to change the physical environment in which pathogens evolve and are transmitted. So from the use of fire, even in the pre-Homo sapiens past, right through the invention of agriculture, changes in transportation technology like the domestication of the donkey or the horse, rises in long distance sail, and then modern steam powered transportation and the rise of steamships and railroads. Each of these technological changes has driven in the long run pathogen evolution and changed the disease environment. So the diseases we suffer in a sense are our own creation. And I think we can see this at a very high level simply by comparing ourselves to our nearest relative, the chimpanzee, and realize that Chimps are not wrong if they look at us and say people are strange. And in fact, people are afflicted with a very strange number, as well as a number of nasty and narrowly focused infectious diseases. So humans have an unusual number of microparasites, particularly when you compare us to other primates. We have particularly virulent infectious diseases. So chimps have some pretty nasty diseases. We've got a whole array of really unusually ferocious pathogens. And then what's particularly, I think, evident biologically is we have a lot of pathogens that are very, very narrowly dedicated to exploit the human body as its primary host. So a number of diseases have evolved to take advantage of our success as a species. When humans create new technologies, it drives ecological change and therefore change in the evolution of infectious diseases. If we change our habitats, if we change our place in the web of animal life, which are important reservoirs of pathogens in the wild, if we change our density and connectivity of human populations, it changes the parameters for the transmission of diseases and therefore shapes the ecology and evolution of diseases. So we are the drivers of change, and nature responds with evolution and changes in turn. With all of that as background, I think it allows us to approach questions in what I would call a biologically realistic way about how the Romans died. And this is a kind of question that's interested thoughtful historians for a long time. And it's also one where I think we live at a particularly exciting moment where we're learning more than we ever have about what pathogens really accounted for mortality in the Roman world. We can only ever glean pieces of the picture, and we can only do so through bringing together different kinds of evidence. So I list here really 5 different kinds of evidence. One is textual sources, and in some cases, medical texts can give us more or less reliable indications of specific infectious diseases, particularly when diseases have symptoms that are highly distinctive or specific. This is often not the case, but sometimes with diseases like malaria that Robert Solaris has for a generation helped us understand the ancient textual record as testimony to, or the example of bubonic plague, which has highly distinctive symptoms. We can draw relatively confident inferences from the textual evidence, but the textual evidence is often limited, very difficult to use, and is, I think, even more powerful when it's put in conversation with other kinds of physical evidence. For one, bioarchaeology, the skeletal record that can sometimes, again, provide generic, but sometimes specific indications of the presence of particular diseases. I give you an example of a skeleton that is inferred to have belonged to a victim of the infectious disease that we mentioned, leprosy, which does indeed become more visible in the Roman period in the skeletal record. So in that sense, Plutarch is not wrong. And provides kind of an important confirmation from the textual record that aligns with what we know so far of the bioarchaeological record. Although leprosy was not an entirely new disease, there is at least reason to believe that it becomes more prevalent. And that's just one example of the way that bioarchaeology and the skeletal record can help us understand the reality of ancient disease. But in recent years, other, and particularly genetic forms of evidence are coming into the conversation. One is ancient pathogen DNA, the recovery of the actual genetic material from archaeological specimens. And this is possible when the DNA of the pathogen was circulating at high enough levels in the victim when he or she died, and when miraculously that pathogen DNA survives over 1,000 to 2,000 years, is recovered and reliably sequenced and identified in laboratories today. This has given us remarkable insights and promises only to grow in the near future. But that's only one of the ways in which genetics is really revolutionizing what we understand about infectious diseases. Phylogenetics is the study of evolutionary relationships. And as we have more and more genetic data, even from current day samples of pathogens, we're able to build much richer evolutionary histories, or what really amount to family trees, of the important biological agents of human disease. So this gives us an evolutionary picture that I'll talk about in just a minute that can sometimes provide really important insights into the diseases that existed in the ancient world. And a final source is human genetics. I'll talk about that in just one second. So using all of these, we can ask, how did people die in this one little particular slice of the past, the very long human story that happens to be of interest to us? I mentioned that the genomes are really revolutionizing what we understand about the evolutionary history of disease, and 3 ways: ancient DNA, as mentioned, the recovery of specimens directly from the victims of ancient diseases is likened to what's been called genetic time travel. And it really is starting to change what we know about the disease environments of the ancient world. I'll just mention Marcel Keller et al.'s paper in PNAS from 2019 that published 8 new sites where the DNA of the plague bacterium in the first plague pandemic was identified from Western Europe as one example of the kind of knowledge that we're gaining from the recovery of archaeological pathogen DNA. As mentioned, phylogenies are family trees, and these can often tell us about where our diseases evolved from. So for instance, it's now been known for about 20 years that tuberculosis, which is closely related to bovine tuberculosis, was a disease that humans caught from cattle. And in fact, the family tree tells us that the human disease is older, it sits on a deeper root of the phylogeny than bovine tuberculosis, and in fact tells us an important historical fact that humans gave tuberculosis to our domesticated cattle, probably twice in fact, rather than the other way around. The evolutionary family trees of pathogens can help us understand the geography and the history of the spread of different diseases. So for instance, it was previously debated whether the main forms of the malaria parasite existed in the New World prior to transatlantic sail. And it turns out that we can tell from the evolutionary tree that this is not the case, that malaria was transported from the old world to the new world in the age of post-Columbian communication. And evolutionary trees can also give us a sense of the age, the time at which some of our most important pathogens evolved. And I'll give an example of that in a minute. But finally, human DNA is itself a record of adaptation. And I think this is going to be one of the really exciting frontiers over the next few years as we get more and more human genomes, both archaeological human genomes as well as current human genomes, like the long series of genomes that were recently published by Antonio et al., showing a time transect through Italian history of human genetic history. Humans evolve continuously, and one of the strongest selection pressures on the human genome is infectious disease. And we're starting to learn a lot about the importance of infectious disease in shaping the human genome. So recently, familial Mediterranean fever, a kind of endemic genetic health condition in the Mediterranean, has been linked to the importance of plague as a disease, particularly in the Eastern Mediterranean. Tuberculosis has been identified as a selective pressure in Western European genomes just over the last few thousand years. And one of the longest standing hypotheses in human evolution is that malaria has profoundly shaped the human genome and is responsible for instance, sickle cell anemia or other red blood cell disorders collectively known as thalassemias. And I think over the next few years, we're likely to get a much better picture of the history of malaria from the record of human genomes, from understanding, for instance, when human diseases like thalassemia become more prevalent in human populations in response to the pressure of diseases like malaria. Let me give just one example where I think all of these different kinds of evidence come together in a powerful way, and that's the measles virus. Measles is an important disease. It's spread via the respiratory route. It's a mild disease if you're already healthy and if you have good health care. If you're not, it can be quite a severe disease. It's extremely contagious, far more so even than COVID-19, which is very contagious. But if you survive it, you acquire basically lifelong immunity, which is also why the vaccine against it works so well. Measles is a complete freak of nature. It shouldn't exist. It's highly specialized in humans and requires huge populations in order to continuously circulate. So measles is a disease, a good example of a respiratory disease that exists and adapts to humans because we exist. This is a paper that was published last year in Science that helps understand the history of measles. It sequenced an early 20th century measles genome from a lung specimen that was preserved in formaldehyde in Berlin that provided a richer picture of the evolutionary history. Measles on the top, you can see, diverges from a very closely related disease known as Rinderpest that's caused by a very closely related virus that causes a horrific disease in cattle. And this provides a slightly older estimate for the emergence. You can see the red distribution on the top is an estimate that measles emerged sometime in the first millennium BCE, and most likely around 500 BCE, plus or minus a couple hundred years. If you look down at the bottom, this is a plot of the size of the largest city in 3 major Old World regions. And you can see that in the period, the timescales align. In the period when the measles virus emerges is exactly when humans start building cities that are above the minimum population threshold for measles to survive, to circulate continuously. And so what these two kinds of charts tell is a story in which humans build large-scale populations that are capable of permanently circulating diseases like measles. That drives evolutionary response as the pathogen adapts to the human host. So it's one, I think, example of the way in which we're learning about the history of these diseases. Other examples include bubonic plague, tuberculosis, falciparum malaria, where we're also, I think, learning how recent the evolution of many of these pathogens really is. So it makes antiquity, I think, a particularly important period when humans build larger cities, larger empires, larger trading networks that bring different populations into contact. Evolution plays into this, and of course creates new diseases. This is allowing us to refine the picture of what we know from diseases that existed in the Roman Empire. We know reasonably that a number of vector, fecal, oral, respiratory, parasitic diseases did exist in the Roman Empire. We suspect that other diseases were missing from the Roman Empire. And there are other cases where we simply still don't understand, like typhus and influenza, whether they existed in the Roman world. So there's still a lot to be learned in the next few years. So I'll close just by saying that I think this kind of biological realism can help us understand the nature of life and death in the ancient world. But I also think that close study of the ancient world can help us understand the human processes that create the ecological and evolutionary conditions for the rise of new diseases, right down through COVID-19. And above all, I think the humanistic purpose of history is to remind us that we as human beings are deeply embedded in the natural world. I'll stop there and look forward to my co-presenters' comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Kyle. I think that means that it's my turn again. So I'd just like to take this time to reiterate again my thanks to Matthew and the Center for Ancient Studies for the chance to speak with all of you. So thank you, all you attendees, all 134 of you. It's amazing. So thank you again for taking some time out of your busy schedules to listen to us. So a little bit of table setting on my end. What I'll do today, I think, charts something of a path between what you just heard from Dr. Harper and what we'll hear shortly from Dr. Gardner. That is, while Dr. Harper concentrated on some of what we might call the environmental realia, like climate and disease regimes, as significant drivers of human historical outcomes, and Dr. Gardner will dwell on pestilence as a potent and labile metaphor for civic discord. I want to focus on the role of pestilence in Greek thought more generally. That means I want to look at how Greeks responded to the phenomenon as pestilence, both real and imagined, and what role such events played within Greek perceptions of their own histories. We'll do so by looking specifically at the famous Athenian plague, together with the even more famous, if fictive, one which sparks the drama of the Iliad. These reflections on disease will then lead us to consider what they might reveal about ancient Greek conceptions of health, especially about what constitutes and sustains the healthy body and the healthy body politic. In the end, I want to stress that in antiquity as today, these disease events are always already entangled in the social and the political, both as they are experienced firsthand and as they are received and reconfigured and repurposed to meet the specific ends of specific peoples in specific contexts. In this way, the history of pestilences is subsumed into the larger historical project of catching new and startling refractions of ourselves as we look backwards in time. I'm just going to share my screen. Share. There we go. All right. So let's begin at Athens. The year is 430 BCE. It's the second summer after hostilities between the Spartans began flared into full-scale war. Pericles, the de facto leader of the democracy, has called the vast Athenian populace from the Attic countryside within the city walls. Conditions are cramped and stifling, with displaced farmers and their families creating or seeking shelter wherever they can. Perhaps you know the rest from Thucydides. He tells us that a loimos, a pestilence, has spilled out of Ethiopia and made its way into Egypt, and then into Persia, and then into the commercial heart of Athens' port town Piraeus. The plague devastates the Athenian population. Doctors are helpless against it, in fact, among the first to die from it. Religion and piety are equally cast aside in the systemic collapse of the social and cultural virtues, which Pericles had so eloquently praised in the funeral oration just prior. Athens' peripeteia is fittingly tragic in scope and scale, or so Thucydides, because there are other traditions which point in exactly opposite directions from Thucydides with respect both to the power of doctors and religion respectively. Perhaps the most striking of these traditions is the one that finds the famous physician Hippocrates of Kos saving Athens from plague. This is a tradition which emerges several generations after the plague, likely sometime in the second half of the 4th century BCE, in the Letters of Hippocrates, a collection of fictitious letters and speeches composed to or by the physician. We'll discuss these letters and the elevation of Hippocrates into something like a cultural hero in a few moments, but it's worth setting out some important facts about classical Greek medicine from the outset. The so-called Hippocratic corpus constitutes some 60-odd medical treatises penned by various individuals at various times with extremely various ideas between the latter 5th and mid 4th centuries BCE. These texts were gathered under the name of Hippocrates, the historically real figure, by the scribe of Alexandria and handed down in different permutations from antiquity until the middle of the 16th century of our era, when the corpus was fixed as we know it today. This is all to say that we do not know who the real Hippocrates was, nor what, if any, of the medical writings that we possess under his name were actually written by him. What we can say, however, is that already in the early 4th century, he was well known as a physician, familiar to Plato and Aristotle both, and by the end of that century, he was capable of being inserted into historical narratives with which he had manifestly nothing to do. Now, the account of Hippocrates saving the city of Athens is notable for several reasons, not least of which is the almost studied silence of Hippocratic texts on the nature of or treatments for epidemic illness, loimos. Indeed, that phenomenon is explicitly dealt with in only 3 passages of the entire extant corpus, comprising something like 11 volumes in the Loeb edition, right? So that's a massive amount of text for only 3 notices explicitly of epidemic illness. So why? Why were these physicians so reluctant to touch on a matter which afflicted so many? To understand, we must first turn to the conceptual framework these healers brought to bear on the body. This group of recently emergent physicians claimed the skill to heal the sick based upon observable and inferable laws of physis, nature, which govern equally the movement of the stars, the winds, the rains, and the constituent stuff of the human body. Indeed, these early philosopher-scientists bundled that body together with all raw physical material. And this material was subjected to various extrinsic forces which produced predictable outcomes following clearly delineated sequences of cause and effect. The earliest explicit theorization of human health and sickness on this model comes down to us from the early philosopher Alcmaeon of Croton, sometime in the early 5th century BCE or so. Alcmaeon is reported to have claimed the following: the essence of health is the isonomia, or the equal distribution, of powers or qualities, dunamis, of the wet and the dry, of the hot and the cold, of the acrid and the sweet, and of all the rest, while a monarchia among them creates disease, for a monarchy of any one is harmful. Disease befalls on the one hand when there is an abundance of hot or cold, and on the other through both an excess or lack of nourishment. It arises in the blood or the marrow or the brain, but stems for some from external causes, such as waters or the land, fatigue, stress, or similar matters. But health Health is the measured blending of such kinds. Now, the political metaphors are striking, and I'm happy to talk about those more in the Q&A. But important for us at the moment is Alcmann's equation of health and a balance of powers or stuffs within the body, right? One quality tipping over into excessive abundance or scarcity engenders disease. Moreover, this balance must be maintained by the coupling of careful regulation of the substances taken into the body with exterior environmental conditions. Now, as we noted above, within the text of the Hippocratic corpus, we find competing ideas and theories concerning the number, the nature, the organic function, and the location of such bodily constituents. So we find a plethora of biles, phlegms, blood, water in various permutations. There's very little agreement within these texts. Nonetheless, Alcmann's emphasis on a blend of these stuffs as the essence of health was generally shared across the Hippocratic corpus. So in sort of abstract thought experiment, right, like to maintain health in a cold and wet months of winter, as they are in Greece, one should eat a drying and warming regimen and take similar exercises to stave off disease. So it's all about the balance. The statement of this is replicated in the Hippocratic treatise on the nature of the human being, stating it thus. Man's body has within it both blood, phlegm, both yellow and black bile, and these are in itself the nature of the body. And it is through these that it feels pain and is healthy. For the body is healthy whenever it contains these substances proportionally with regard to their blending, their power and amounts, especially if they are perfectly mixed. But it is in pain whenever one of these grows lesser or greater, is separated within the body and not mixed together with all the rest. For it is natural whenever one of these substances is separate and isolated that one place become diseased. Health and illness, consequentially, are individual affairs with wider environmental factors impinging only to the extent that they influence the qualitative balance of bodily substances. We can begin to see in some part then why the Hippocratics were so hesitant to take on the matter of contagious epidemic illness. The causal factors of widespread illness fit poorly with the prioritization of individual regimens intended to meet the needs of individual humoral constitutions. Indeed, the very few passages which offer accounts of epidemic illness, again, on the nature of the human being and the text on breath, attribute its cause to corrupted or stained air, miasma, as the basic common pathogenic factor. Yet neither of these accounts fully agree with one another, and only one, that given in breaths, gives anything like a causal mechanism for how air itself could, one, become corrupted in the first place, and two, how that corruption might affect the body. In elaborating a theory of health and disease contingent on a blend of bodily stuffs and exterior environmental conditions, then the Hippocratics appear to have theorized themselves out of a concept of contagion. The two models of pathogenesis were simply incompatible beyond a poorly sketched notion of miasmatic airs. But so too, the religious foundations underpinning miasma as a concept itself may have played a leading and significant, or at least significant, role in Hippocratic resistance to folding contagion into their conceptual and explanatory toolkits. For ancient Greeks and Romans alike, miasma and its Latin counterpart, contagio, that's contagion, were first and foremost stains incurred for the transgression against the divine, and stains which were easily passed on to the community members whom that transgressor had encountered. Here, then, the miasmatic pestilence is miasma par excellence. Hippocratics, eager to create some visible distance between themselves and religious experts in a crowded field of healers, then shied away from contagion theory, even as it was empirically apparent to the keen observers like Thucydides. With this understanding of Hippocratic health and disease in hand, then, we may now ask how it was that Hippocrates came to be associated with the plague of Athens in antiquity and beyond. As I mentioned earlier, we hear first of Hippocrates' involvement in the plague of Athens within the biographical tradition, which accreted onto the corpus of medical texts throughout the Hellenistic and into the imperial Roman periods. in what is probably the earliest of these documents, known as the Embassy, which takes the form of an address given by Hippocrates' son Thessalus to the Athenians. Hippocrates' salvation of Athens stands among a variety of medical benefactions that Coan healers have performed, not only for Athens, but for all of Greece, spanning the Trojan to the Peloponnesian Wars. As other historians have seen, this speech, however obviously fictitious, was part of a concerted and ingenious PR campaign launched by Kos in a bid for international relevancy in the rapidly changing world of the latter 4th century BCE. Nevertheless, and even against Thucydides' hugely influential account of the Athenian plague, the Coan version stuck. Hippocrates' ability to avert pestilence was reworked within the dossier of the letters themselves. So we find him refusing to aid the Persian Artaxerxes being besieged by plague, which is represented in this 18th century painting. But it also spread into other traditions. Indeed, the 1st century BCE Roman polymath Varro, in his agricultural manual De Re Rustica, has caused to mention Hippocrates' salvation of Athens from the plague. Pliny, among others like Plutarch, also notes Hippocrates' intervention twice in his natural history, adding now the critical detail that Hippocrates managed the trick by burning bonfires to purify the corrupted air, a practice which would continue with Hippocrates' imprimatur up into the 17th century in London. Beyond the telling fact that ancient Greeks and Romans were apparently dissonances between Thucydides' eyewitness account of the Athenian plague, the silence of the early medical texts supposedly penned by Hippocrates himself, and the Coan propaganda which parachutes him into the middle of the action, the core of the tradition discloses something important. For Greeks and for Romans alike, pestilence, both real and imagined, held tremendous sociopolitical explanatory power, which, as we will see, could be deployed on a number of levels. That ideological significance of pestilence surfaces within our 3rd accounting of the Athenian plague. Scholia, that is, commentaries on classical works which were produced later in later antiquity, scholia to dramas like Aristophanes' Frogs or Sophocles' Women of Trachis, inform us that far from the Thucydidean turning away from religion, Athenians embraced a new cult figure as the polis' savior. Heracles Alexikakos, or Heracles the Averter of Evil, whose existence is confirmed by an inscription dated to the middle of the 4th century BCE and the votive relief you can see here. The intervention of a healing god or hero in the warding away of plague was not a one-off event in the myth history of Athens, nor other polis. In fact, Athens celebrated a cluster of gods like Apollo, Artemis, even Dionysus, who were held responsible for averting or bringing pestilences to a halt. Similarly, seers and sages such as Melampus, the Cretan Epimenides, or even the Scythian Abaris were known to have cleansed Argos, Sparta, or Athens of disruptive pestilences. Uniting all these cases is not the simple fact of dread disease afflicting a population, but their community-facing outcomes, whether through the introduction of new cults or political institutions and settlements, which then go on to define that community. That is, these plagues function ideologically themselves, disclosing to us the power of loimos to sculpt collective history. If I can anticipate Hunter here for a moment, perhaps, these myth historical plagues rewrite moments of actual socio-political crisis and their resulting resolutions as natural events, which both explain and normalize conventional features of community life and communal identity. The conceptual paradox of plagues, its very productive tension, is in the ability to define communities against their unmaking. In fact, the enactment of community solidarity against the socially disruptive capacities of plagues were the key to the largely ritual responses mustered by ancient Greeks against loimos. Let us now turn to that other great literary plague then, the one which helps to ignite the implacable wrath of Achilles. Again, the story is familiar. After Agamemnon spurns the pleas of Achilles' priest Croesus, the archer god rains his arrows of pestilence upon the Achaean host until Agamemnon concedes the return, the priest's daughter, but only in exchange for Achilles' own spear bride. As has well been seen, the destruction of this plague, like Thucydides, reifies the potential civil violence latent within the Achaean host. Less attention is paid, however, to the actual mechanism which disperses that plague. That is, after the host returns Chryseis to her father, we find the Achaeans joining together to sing and dance the Paean song. And you can see that on the left. All day and night, the Achaean youths propitiated the far-shooting god by singing and dancing the beautiful Paean song, and the god was glad in hearing it. That is, the god does not fully relax his anger against the Achaeans until he is properly appeased by the Paean. Now, the Paean is a complicated generic history within the study of ancient Greek poetry, a history that doesn't need to detain us for very long here. What's critical for us is that, as we see in Homer, from the archaic to Hellenistic Greece and beyond, the Paean was associated with Apollo and his mastery over human health and disease. Yet beyond that immediate association with Apollo, where was the healing power of the Paean song felt to reside? How did the performance of this song avert plague or restore a community to health? And what does it tell us about Greek ideas about health more broadly? Something of a scholarly consensus has emerged that the performance of the Paean was fundamentally an expression of the solidarity of the male citizenry, both as it affected and the confusion of the poets. Ian Rutherford, in his book on Paeanes, expresses it thus. The Paean represents, quote, the Paean represents the organization and exhibition of the collective strength of adult males. Such performances were perceived as promoting the safety and the stability of the polis, end quote. The Paean finds its healing efficacy, its apotropaic power of averting disaster, precisely through the representational energies of the united polis. Indeed, here we can glimpse how deeply rooted the idea of the healthy body politic is for Greeks, such that it's not a metaphor, not really, but an embodied attitude expressed in the choreographed motions of the civic community. Tellingly, this sense of community could expand and contract according to time and place. On the local level, the so-called Erythraean Paean, which you have on the right, is illustrative. Probably originally inscribed in the Ionian polis of Erythrae in the 4th century BCE, and found copied elsewhere across the Greco-Roman world with localizing variations. This short paean instructs Apollo to visit the polis with its wide dancing spaces, and to grant the chorus that they may see the sun's rays with famous holy Hugiaea, that is, health. At Erythrae, the song is prefaced too with a set of prose instructions that participants dance around Apollo's altar in order that the youth of the city may be spared the disease or other misfortune. Thus, the generation and maintenance of the health of the polis again surfaces as the primary aim of the Paean. Other Paeanes, like Pindar's 6th Paean, which we only have kind of fragmentarily, or Philodamus's 4th century Paean to Dionysus, were performed at Delphi for the important Panhellenic festival of the Theoxenia. Despite vast differences in content, these songs equally stress the well-being of the worshiping community, as it was expanded to include all of Hellas, reaffirming in their performance the Greek sense of a shared identity and belonging. For Greeks, then, health could be seen, it could be felt, it could be enjoyed within the coordinated harmony of collective action. What then can be taken away from all of this for challenging times? A pessimistic answer? Not much. Thucydides' accounting of the plague and its concomitant dissolution of civil society has provided the historical grist for now seemingly countless op-eds on COVID's power to diagnose our own ailing body politic. But such analogies rather miss the point and only expose the huge gap between our world and his. Despite terrible loss of life, modern medicine is triumphing. The institutions and forces driving political fractiousness today would be unintelligible to Athenian Democrats. Thucydides' world is manifestly not our own. Yet, it is the reflexive impulse to look backwards at what came before that creates the bridge between the Greek experience and our own. Pestilence was an essential way for Greeks understood their history and their place in it, that is, for understanding themselves. In casting back to Thucydides' account of the plague or any of the other traditions surrounding that event, we engage in the all too human activity of making meaning from senseless suffering. Here, the Greeks are excellent teachers, and here is perhaps where we can be better students. We've seen that against Hippocratic conceptualization and prioritization of the individual body, Greek thinking about health could be more capacious, more outward facing, more sensitive to the embodied interdependencies upon which human flourishing depends. The Pion models and celebrates these interdependencies as the foundation of the stable, the healthy body politic, a body politic resilient to the exogenous shocks of pestilence. Now, I'm hardly suggesting that we all get together and perform the Erythraia and Pion, but to turn to Greek conceptions of health, redirect our attentions away from our own bodies and towards the manifold ways those bodies are enmeshed with countless others. Thanks a lot, and I'm going to hand it now over to Professor Gardner.
So first of all, thanks so much to Matthew and Mara for organizing this series, and Callaway, thanks for the introduction, but also for kind of laying the groundwork for some of what I'm going to say today. So I think our presentations will proceed nicely from each other. I'm actually going to start with Camus, whose novel La Peste, or The Plague, describes the character of Dr. Roux, who's just heard the word plague uttered as a possible explanation for the illness afflicting the seaside community of Oran. Dr. Roux thinks of Lucretius, quote, who was looking at the Gulf and thought of the pyres that Lucretius tells us the Athenians built on the seashore when they were stricken with illness. The dead were brought there at night, but there was too little space, and the living would fight with each other with burning torches to put their loved ones on the pyres, engaging in bloody struggles rather than abandon their dead bodies on the beach. Lucretius, of course, is the Roman poet who ends his epic De Rerum Natura with an account of Athenian plague, the same one that Callaway was talking about of 430, and the one that Thucydides famously documents. But Lucretius alters key details. Where Thucydides had noted that citizens covertly left bodies of kin on funeral pyres and then snuck off, Lucretius has citizens brawling openly with each other around blazing fires. Today, I want to consider why Lucretius might have altered his account in the way he does, and say a few words about how the plague metaphor allowed Romans at the turn of the first millennium to grapple with internal discord. But then I'd like to turn to a few mostly 20th and 21st century novels and films that appear contaminated by what we might call the Roman tradition. That is, they borrowed some tropes of pestilence developed in Latin literature. By understanding the social tensions that the Romans were working through in telling their stories of disease, we can, I think, better understand what we're trying to work through today as we shape our own narratives of epidemics and pandemics, both the fictional and the, of course, the very real pandemic of COVID-19. As Priscilla Wald's work on the outbreak narrative has made clear, stories of contagious disease show us not only how we are connected, but with whom, even as the threat of mortality and the impulse to self-preservation strains those relationships to the breaking point. As Callaway and I think Kyle also alluded to, the ancients didn't have a real clear idea of contagion and how microbes were transmitted, but they were keenly aware of the role that social proximity played in the spread of illness, as the words contagium and contagio, both from contingo, meaning touch, indicate. In their accounts of plague, writers of the late Republic and Augustan eras added distinctly Latin idioms. to describe the deteriorating physical body. They're very interested in the language of rotting and bodily dissolution. Right? These writers also focus on social pathologies that reflect on distinctly Roman values, for instance, pietas, the sort of respect for family members and God and country, but especially within the family. Unlike their Greek forerunners, Roman accounts of disease foreground distinct relationships between parents, children, siblings, and spouses, relationships compromised in the context of an epidemic, and also in the context of civil war. So where Thucydides' account of Athenian plague refers generally to how kin treated each other, usually with the terms like philos or philoi, loved ones, Lucretius is very distinct with his familial terminology. And here we have a slide basically where he describes family members whose limbs are entangled in death. He notes very specifically mothers, fathers, children, sons, all in this one heap of illness. Also, he, at the very end of his plague, which has struck a lot of readers as just very discomforting, he describes that brawling over funeral pyres that I mentioned earlier. And each man in his sorrow buried his own dead as time and circumstances allowed. Need and poverty persuaded many to dreadful expedients, for they would lay their own kindred amidst loud lamentation among piles of wood not their own, and set light to the fire, often brawling with much shedding of blood rather than abandoning the bodies. And of course, it is this vibrant portrait of families under pressure that makes this his closing image in the poem resonate so with Camus, whose Dr. Roux summons the poet's account rather than Thucydides in speculating on what burial of those dead from plague might look like in Oran. Now, here are some major plagues, major plague narratives of the period under discussion. In other words, the late Republic and the early Empire. Most of them are treatments in epic, although Livy, the historian, is also very noteworthy for some fairly extended accounts of epidemics and perhaps endemic diseases that struck the Romans in their very early history. Now, I've also tried to give you an idea of how those dates of Lucretius, Virgil, Livy, and Ovid correspond with this really tumultuous period at the end of the Republic. In other words, the end of a long series of civil wars that really got bad around 48 at the Battle of Pharsalus, and then lasted, of course, until about 31, when Augustus finally defeated Mark Antony and Cleopatra at Actium. And when writers of all sorts describe these civil wars, they very much rely on the terminology of fratres, of brotherhood. Now, it's not merely fortuitous that the Romans chose contagious disease as a metaphor for addressing problems of internal discord. And I want to turn now briefly to a theorist of disease discourse in particular, René Girard, who's concerned with how epidemic disease and its representations have a homogenizing, potentially purifying effect on afflicted communities. Girard focuses intently on epidemics in the literary and mythic imagination and their role in staging social crises. So for Girard, contagion initiates a, quote, process of undifferentiation, a destruction of specificities, one that culminates not primarily in a tabula rasa, a clean slate, as some other disease discourse theorists have postulated, but instead he finds the identification of a sacrificial scapegoat, whose expulsion purifies the polluted social order, a key component of these narratives. He observes how they tend to transform existing societies conceived of as finely graded hierarchies into aggregates, big homogeneous masses of bodies upon bodies. Such a collapse of distinctions within the social order is born from intense competition for limited resources and limited honors. Girard describes this competition for the same distinction that results in a kind of mirroring between individuals as mimetic doubling. And he posits this doubling as one of three central features of the plague narrative. So basically, he studied a long tradition of fictive and non-fictive accounts of disease. And he kind of narrowed down three recurring characteristics, and I've sort of condensed them here. So these diseases and the accounts achieve an epidemic status. In other words, they beset a whole community. The narrative triggers rivalry among mimetic doubles. These are opposing protagonists, and they're often structured as a binary that collapses. Contamination ultimately makes people indistinguishable from each other. This process of, constant binaries collapsing culminates in a sacrificial theme that may require a scapegoat. And once the expulsion of this scapegoat occurs, distinctions can reassert themselves and the social order can be healed. Of course, the myth of Oedipus is perhaps the example, the classic example of this particular pattern, because once he's expelled from Thebes, Thebes can more or less start to heal. Girard's model is not the only way to account for the tendency of cultures to produce plague narratives, or even the best way. But I do think the model allows a better understanding of why Romans, who were so plagued by civil war in the late 1st century, might use stories of pestilence to work through the competitive strife among equals that had led to civil war. A war among brothers who gradually, while striving for autonomy and distinction, lose the ability to differentiate themselves. In other words, the model offers a useful way of formulating political strife of the late Republic, where these very powerful aristocrats, Crassus, Pompey, Caesar, Cato, etc., they were all vying for leadership of Rome in one form or another. And they had all existed in a kind of symbolic brotherhood, even though it was a very antagonistic one. And that antagonism, of course, we can trace way back to the roots of Rome's founding with the fratricide, the myth of Romulus and Remus, right? Now, so here we have an example from Virgil, whose poem on the Georgics was in circulation just around the time that the Battle of Actium was concluded in favor of Augustus. He describes an outbreak of cattle plague in Noricum. He uses heavily anthropomorphizing language, and in particular language of fraternal bonds. So even though he confines his narrative to livestock, we are struck by the tauri, the bulls, the fratres, who falter with illness in the field. And so here I have a quote where we learned that once the bulls get sick, the disheartened farmer, separating the grieving bull from his dying brother, goes on and abandons his plow, left stuck in the middle of its task. The poet Ovid also gives us an account of plague, a mythical plague that struck the human community of Aegina, though the solution to that pestilence is an entirely new citizenry born from ants. And here we have a slide with an illustration inspired by the episode in Ovid's Metamorphoses. So after the old population is wiped out by plague, Jupiter helps transform these little ants you can see in the bottom corner into little men who presumably get bigger than the illustration suggests. And yet this new group of young men, they're all loyal to a single father figure, and they're striking primarily for their equality. So we now have a community of those mimetic doubles, those equals, as Ovid stresses at the end of his account. In fact, and I won't read the entire passage, but after King Iacchus has divided up the lands, he notes how thrifty these people are, and these fellows, equal in years and courage, will follow you to war. And of course, that's going to recap a comment earlier in the passage where Cephalus, one of the speakers, comments, I was so pleased to encounter a group of young men so handsome and so equal in age, which of course does not bode well for the future of this community if we have in mind those mimetic doubles. So one of the big takeaways from my reading of these epic plague narratives is that pressures put on the family as well as on the individual's relationship with the wider community that emerge as paramount concerns. And now I'm going to leap forward in time so we can think further about what those Roman concerns can tell us about our own more recent stories of pestilence. I want to start with a gem from the early 19th century, Mary Shelley's The Last Man, but then I'm going to fast forward to 20th and 21st century novels and film. Now, Shelley's novel is important, though, because it foregrounds fraternal strife and familial relationships in a way that's clearly indebted to Roman tradition. But I also think it relies on a relatively conventional notion of the family that more recent examples of plague lit and cinema tend to work against. In her futuristic Plague, Shelley turns to Roman oracular power to speculate on how pestilence impacts the human subject and her relationship to the larger community. In her author's introduction, Shelley cites the leaves of Virgil's Sibyl at Cuma as a source of the prophecies that are really the inset narrative. In other words, this future plague that's envisioned in the novel. And she notes, I have often wondered at the subject of the Sibyl's verses and at the English dress of the Latin poet. The mythologies of Rome's founding also are evident in the internal testimony of the novel's last man, Lionel Verney, who devotes much of his account to his childhood spent as, quote, an uncouth a savage as the wolf-bred founder of Rome. By the novel's closure, Verney arrives in Rome pondering its relics and perusing its libraries, reflecting self-consciously on his former identity as a Romulus figure, one with, quote, robber and shepherd propensities similar to those of the city's founder. Verney's final observations of Rome as the crowning achievement of human civilization and his concerted engagement with Latin literature brings his journey full circle. Now, a specter of civil war haunts England throughout Verney's account of his maturity and well into the plague's encroachment. Verney befriends England's former crown prince, Adrian, a relationship that is formalized as brotherhood through marriage. While Adrian expresses strong support for the country's new Republican Constitution, many of the other English aristocrats are not so keen on it, including a fellow named Raymond, who is also one of Verney's brothers through marriage, and eventually becomes the Lord Protector under the new government. Now, despite the novel's futuristic setting, Verney makes references to Roman civil war and revolution, as well as political revolutions in France and America. His understanding of these events guides his observation on strife that plagues England. Verney views England as constantly on the eve of civil war, a threat not entirely dissipated until after the plague has invaded England's shores. So as the novel develops, we observe Verney's responses to the crisis. His marriage and his family grows in juxtaposition with those of his brother-in-law, Adrian. Adrian assumes a position of leadership in England during the plague. Now, it's a lack of familial entanglements that really liberate Adrian and allow him to do so. In other words, he doesn't have the bonds of marriage or paternity to complicate his responses to the plague. In contrast, Verney, again, our narrator, feels the constant pull of his wife, Idris, and their 2 children, and his desire to protect them shapes his attitude towards interacting with the larger community. Though compassion for those outside the familial unit eventually guide his moral compass. Now, if Shelley's novel enacts the, quote, drama of self and other that is described by Stevenson as characteristic of plague literature, it recognizes a human impulse towards companionship as much as towards alienation and autonomy. From a Girardian perspective, the mimetic rivalries reflected in representations of plague ironically culminate in the supreme autonomy of Verney. In the closing paragraphs, he keeps saying, I alone, a narrator who wishes for nothing more than human companionship. Conscious of the tension between the human drive for distinction and the ambiguous comforts of group identity, Verney is in the end granted only the comfort of unfettered individuality. Now, I hope that wasn't too much of a spoiler, but I guess really the title kind of gave it away. So Margaret Atwood takes up a similar strand of eschatological thinking in her trilogy on the eradication or near eradication of the human race through a genetically engineered virus. So 3 novels written over a decade, Oryx and Crake, The Year of the Flood, and Mad Adam, they fixate on human efforts to master the knowledge of nature through bioengineering, whose crowning achievement is the virus Juve, jet speed ultra virus extraordinary. And it's designed by a character referred to as Crake. And it nearly obliterates the human species in what's called a waterless flood. Now, Crake's motive for designing this virus is what he understands as the fundamentally flawed condition of humanity, one born from, quote, king of the castle hardwiring and perpetuated by property acquisition, marriage bonds, and familial lineage. Within a sealed off compound, he engineers a species of Crakers, physically flawless creatures with enhanced immune systems, to replace Homo sapiens. Crakers have no propensity for ownership or erotic attachments that lead to marriage and kinship bonds. And in fact, most of the human protagonists in the trilogy have no familial attachments, except those that have been seriously compromised. That is to say that intensely problematic family relationships within Atwood's dystopia provide a pretty reasonable defense of Crake's decision to do away with humanity. I mean, the nuclear family is portrayed as inherently dysfunctional and beyond repair. Though one of the compelling features of the trilogy is its interest in how, in the absence of traditional family structures, characters form new and often healthy quasi-familial bonds. Now, before leaving the literary world behind and focusing in the end of my talk on a few cinematic examples, I did want to mention a very recent entry into the genre, Paul Tremblay's Survivor Song, which is also very much about the bonds of kinship that are tested during an outbreak of contagious disease. One of the protagonists is an expectant mother, Natalie, who may or may not have contracted a highly lethal variant of the rabies virus. After her husband succumbs to disease, We follow her story as she reunites with an old college friend, and that friend tries to get her the medical attention she needs to perhaps save her unborn child. Now, as with Atwood's novels, the story is set in a world where the nuclear family is no longer the bedrock of social stability. Characters redefine family, sisterhood, and even brotherhood in very unexpected ways. So now I want to close with what may be the contagion narrative par excellence in the contemporary world, and that is the zombie film. I should say that I have been a fan of the genre since a very impressionable age, those of George Romero in particular. The most gripping moment of this kind of outbreak narrative, for me anyway, was always when a family member got infected. Now, after examining what the Romans did with their own outbreak stories, and using them in part to explore tensions within the family unit, as well as between the family and the community, I think I got a better idea of why this part of the zombie narrative was so compelling. It prompted all kinds of questions about self-preservation and self-sacrifice. What parent wouldn't nurse their child to the bitter end and possibly risk infection? But what if the child has a sibling or, who also needs care? Or looking at this family from the perspective of the outside community, wouldn't it be best to just kill or exile the entire family? So Night of the Living Dead of 1968 and 69 observes the spread of contagion from the perspective of Ben, a very unattached African-American man. The living individuals who attempt to escape disease and survive with him enter the film bound to each other by family and erotic attachments. So frictions are generated among survivors primarily over indecision concerning what to do with the infected loved ones. For instance, the character Barbara, who is sort of traumatized by a cemetery incident, she responds first with uncertainty and then with fatal vulnerability to her infected brother, Johnny. But it's the fate of the Cooper family here, depicted in the slide, that most effectively raises the issue of familial devotion. Near the end of the film, it becomes apparent that Karen, who's lying down, she's the daughter of Helen and Harry. She's been bitten and is coming down with the vaguely defined zombie disease. Survivors agree that it would be prudent to relegate the child in the basement, but the parents refuse to leave Karen alone, and they can't register that their daughter is becoming something different, something very dangerous. The family crisis is perhaps predictable, perhaps because so many of Romero's successors would use the same bit of dramatic tension, but its predictability is matched by equal poignancy and horror over the images of Karen biting her father in the arm and then brutally murdering her mother with a trowel. And you can see her biting her dad here on the right. Since Romero's many contributions to the genre, including, by the way, a novel that was published posthumously in 2020, we've seen a couple of very critically acclaimed successors, in particular, 28 Days Later. The first of these depicts a jarringly rapid transformation of a beloved father, Frank, before the eyes of his daughter. In the slide, you can see where he's just gotten a drop of infected blood in his eye, and of course, immediately is going to turn into a zombie. Now, it's noteworthy that among the group of survivors, Frank and Hannah are the only two that share a kinship bond. Also, 28 Weeks Later has a plot rooted in family betrayal. The father, Don, has in fact abandoned his wife, who he thought might be dead, at the outbreak of the rage virus. But as it turns out, she's not only alive, but she's also a carrier of the disease. and possibly a key to curing the virus. And of course, she's also not very happy because she knows that her husband abandoned her. Finally, we have, and I just came across this recent entry. It's an Irish film, The Cured, which does an interesting twist with the zombie mythos. In this version, there is a cure for the zombie virus, but the catch is you remember what you did while you were a zombie. And even though there's a lot of political commentary going on in terms of how factions emerge in the Irish community, the big reveal is generated from fraternal bloodshed. It turns out that Senan, who is cured and sent to live with his widowed sister-in-law, had actually killed his own brother in a fit of zombie rage. But of course, she doesn't know that when she takes him in. Now, we've come a long way from Lucretius's funeral pyres and the families fighting over them. And I don't mean to suggest that all of these novelists and filmmakers are consciously turning to Roman plague to comment on social tensions in the contemporary world. But I do think that Roman epic poets, by foregrounding certain conflicts that are exacerbated in the context of an epidemic, allow us to see those more clearly in our own narratives of disease. Contagion materializes and makes visible those social interactions that are most dear and familiar, even as it destroys them. And I should just say that when I was starting research for this project many years ago, the question arose in a reading group, why plague why is it so apocalyptic? Why is it so revelatory, so much more than other shared crises like an earthquake or a tsunami, or a famine or an alien invasion, although alien invasions and viruses are not mutually exclusive, as the 2007 reboot of Invasion of the Body Snatchers reminds us. But plague is, I think, distinctive because it demonstrates social and physical contact within the community. And what I think Roman writers really help us see is which relationships we value, which ones are evolving, and which ones are perhaps in need of repair. And of course, our own narratives of COVID have demonstrated a good deal of that, but I will leave comments for that perhaps in the following discussion. So thank you very much. And I will now turn things back over to Callaway and Matthew.
So now we'll open the field up to questions. We already have some dropped in the Q&A. Okay, so we have Susan Prince, who is throwing us back to tuberculosis and wants to know, how do we know that we didn't give tuberculosis back to the cows and first round DNA was superseded?
How do we know? Could you say that one more time? How do we know
that we didn't give tuberculosis back to the cows and that the first round
back to the cows? I see what the question's asking. How do we know with certainty that the human pathogen is the evolutionary source of the bovine pathogen? And it's a good question. And when we're talking about genetic evidence, we're always dependent on what we happen to have or to be able to sample. So there can always be surprises, and sometimes have been. In this case, a couple of things. It's clear that the human form of the bacterium is ancestral to the bovine form as we know it. But that doesn't exclude, I think this is what the question is getting at, that there could have been an ancestral bovine form that's now extinct. And so it's possible, but it's sheer hypothesis and seems unlikely, particularly given that the tuberculosis family tree has shown a lot of surprises. And I'd say there probably is a lot that we don't understand completely about the origins of tuberculosis. We don't really understand exactly where it comes from. It now looks much younger than was for a long time believed. It's probably only 3,000, 3,500 years old in the forms that we have any ability to observe it. And we don't know what the ancestral form was doing, possibly even an environmental bacterium that became a pathogen. But it's been detected in a range of animals. And one of the really strange things is that all of the animal forms seem to derive from human forms. So as we know it right now, it looks like humans gave tuberculosis to a lot of animals, sometimes maybe directly, but probably more often indirectly. So all of the animal branches seem to descend from ancestral human branches, which is a pretty strange story. And I expect that this is one that when there is more sampling, we'll probably fill in some of the gaps. But it's clear that humans have a pretty major role in spreading tuberculosis around the world. It seems to originate in East Africa only 3,000 to 3,500 years ago, and is probably the most deadly infectious disease in human history. So it really is a deeply human disease that we're going to be a big part of the story of spreading it to other animals. But there may be pieces we don't know. So that's a quick answer.
Great. And keeping with TB, Madison Stewart wants to know if you could say, Kyle, if you could say more about any archaeological evidence of co-immunities, for example, between TB and leprosy, a hypothesis that is yet to be proven nor disproven.
I don't know about archaeological evidence, but there's an old hypothesis that infection with either tuberculosis or leprosy confers immunity to the other. So this is sometimes the case with closely related pathogens. For instance, if you get dengue fever, which is a flavivirus, you may have some immunity to yellow fever, which is a closely related virus. The bacteria that cause tuberculosis and leprosy are both mycobacteria. They're not particularly closely related, but they're in the scheme of things, they're similar. This may be familiar to students of antiquity because Mirko Germek, in his really amazing book on disease in the ancient Greek world, actually spends a lot of time on this hypothesis that leprosy and tuberculosis confer immunity, cross immunity. And so he works that out, and it's sometimes also brought into conversation with one of the really curious historical questions, which is why did leprosy decline? So leprosy is a major disease from late antiquity through early modernity in Europe. And it's still around in the 17th, 18th century, but its incidence clearly seems to decline in Europe in the modern period when tuberculosis manages to become the number one infectious disease. So one thought has been that maybe the rise of tuberculosis sort of crowds out leprosy, but I don't think that is particularly convincing. And there are probably other reasons. Tuberculosis had been a nasty and prevalent disease long before then. And there are probably other reasons for the decline of leprosy, which is incompletely understood. So I think at present, the consensus is that there isn't strong cross immunity, but I also would want to look into that. But it's an interesting question.
Great. I'm actually going to mix it around a little bit. So for Calloway and Hunter from Eric Fournier, do you believe that it's the discourse of purity and pollution included in plague narratives that the authors you both discuss find attractive and easily transferable to the political situations that concerned them? And Hunter, do you want to take this one up first?
What would I say? Well, so for instance, in the accounts that I've looked at, in particular, Virgil's Third Georgic, it's a really strange situation because you do get depictions of priests trying to divine what is the nature, did we transgress against the gods? How can we remedy that? And they really, the priests of Noricum get no answer. There is no clear signal that they've done anything wrong, which has led to some very pessimistic readings of the entire episode. Because if you don't know what you've done wrong, how do you correct that? And I think that's that same problem of let's look to the gods for an answer and find out where we've transgressed. you know, and at times that does tend to, it can bolster political authority. You know, if the Sibylline books, for instance, in Livy, you know, confirm that the Romans acted correctly in handling a plague or in remedying the plague by restoring the Pax Deorum, then certainly it could, you know, either affirm the status quo or maybe augment the power of a particular political leader. That's what I would say for Rome. So it's sort of a mixed bag. I don't think there's any one trend in terms of how that discourse impacted political power. But Callaway, you might have different things to say from the Greek side of things.
Yeah, and this kind of goes to my question eventually for you, Hunter, is how you actually see this very peculiar sort of history of thinking about the body politic in Rome, but relying on literary traditions that kind of deny the Greek literary traditions. We just see the sort of the plucking of Thucydides, and that's kind of it. When we have a ton of other plagues in the Greek world, so maybe that's for later. What do I see between, you know, I don't really discuss that much, you know, these questions of purity and pollution, because that's kind of a different discourse than the one that I wanted to focus on here. But it's true that particularly the generation of pollution is a big conceptual driver for some of the histories that I kind of invoke within the talk, right? So these moments of crises are generally triggered by the pollution of an individual, and this goes to something that Hunter was talking about, the creation then of a scapegoat in order to release the social tension, right? And then sort of rehomogenize that group, that stable body politic that, you know, pions are one way of doing it, but the actual ritual of scapegoating is another, and they're closely conceptually aligned, but they have completely different ritual mechanisms. But questions of purity too, you know, these are tricky within Greece, and particularly when you're looking at the medical texts, because they take up the same language as the religious texts, right? The catharsis is how you cleanse the body in both traditions. So we need some kind of disambiguation between the two, a disambiguation that Greeks could either understand or exploit, or they could exploit that ambiguity in interesting ways. So I don't know if that actually answers your question in any meaningful way, but it's basically to say that it's a really complicated mixing of traditions that bears further thought. So I think this is from Minu Tharor. I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name, but I think this is a really important and interesting question that all of us, I think, it's imperative that all of us answer, but maybe Kyle is best equipped to answer it first. They say, thank you very much for very instructive presentations, but the Greco-Roman focus seems a little limiting to understand pandemics in antiquity and beyond. What about pandemics during antiquity in non-Mediterranean Aegean regions, e.g. China or India? Even from a Hellenistic or Roman perspective, did contact with Egyptian, Persian, Gandharan, or Indian systems enter into knowledge or practice regarding infectious diseases? Would be fascinating to know what Alexander's armies or Roman trading activity contracted or spread, and how that affects notions of contagion.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question and a really big one. I'll just say a few things, which that I think, first of all, that I really agree that we need to think of disease history and history of plagues in really wide geographical terms, because I think that many of the big disease events that are interesting in Roman history, whether you're talking about the Antonine Plague or the Plague of Cyprian or the Justinianic Plague and the first pandemic, are episodes in the history of human health that aren't really just Mediterranean events. And we're only seeing a part of the picture if that's what we see. Now, I'll say too, a word of warning that I think we have to be careful about reproducing narratives about plague coming from elsewhere, vague notions that the plagues come from the east or from Ethiopia. So your Thucydides gets that rumor going, and it really never quits. And so it makes it very hard sometimes to know whether that's a trope or whether that's an important observation. But in general, we're only going to gain knowledge if we engage with scholars in other literary and archaeological traditions who can bring to the table, I think, really important information. So let me just give one specific example, which is the Antonine Plague, which I mentioned is an outbreak of disease that reaches the Roman Empire in the mid-160s AD. And as I said, we don't know exactly what germ caused it. Most Roman historians have thought smallpox. It's actually pretty problematic in some ways, but they may not be totally wrong. It could be a kind of ancestor of smallpox. I've argued that it very much is a new infectious disease that travels over commercial circuits that connected Rome to Africa, the Indian Ocean, the Near East, and East Asia. And we have just hints of this. For instance, there's an important series of Sabaic inscriptions from Arabia in the 150s that describe a horrific plague happening in Arabia right before the Antonine Plague. Of course, we can't know with certainty that that's the same disease outbreak, but I think it's a really interesting data point that says maybe this really was part of a much bigger event that reached well beyond the Roman Empire. Of course, the Romans themselves think that the Antonine Plague originates in the midst of the campaign against Parthia in Seleucia on the Tigris. What we would really love to know, and there's been some work on this, but whether or not it's connected with events in China that are well attested in the very rich chronicle and historical record of ancient China. And I think it's very possible that the Antonine Plague is actually part of a kind of old world disease event that stretches across the entirety of Eurasia. But to get there will take, I think, close examination of the written as well as potentially the archaeogenetic record. And particularly this kind of biologically realistic work that's willing to ask risky question. Can we say what disease that was? Can we figure it out from the Roman sources? Can we figure it out from the Chinese sources? But there's an example where we would love to know what the global scale impact and reach of this pandemic was. So I think it's a great question, and hopefully motivates collaborative work across different fields of ancient studies.
I mean, just to follow up briefly in terms of representations of disease, again, when I started working on this, I ran across a German scholar, Grimm, who did an account of plagues in Greco-Roman literature, and he mentions in passing that plague lit is really a Western phenomenon. And I gave it a little bit of thought, and then I sort of asked my colleagues in Chinese and other language fields, do you have these long extended accounts of etiology, symptomatology, epidemiology that Thucydides really gives birth to in a way? And while they could point to some sources that mention plagues, this real tradition of writing the plague and enriching it with those kinds of details has struck me as something that was born from the Greco-Roman tradition. Now, since then, I have come across a few sources in Arabic and Chinese that do perhaps flirt or tease out other details of plague in the way that some of our Roman and Greek writers do. But I think more work needs to be done on that. But at the time, I just sort of registered it as a different way of approaching these crises. This is how the Romans and Greeks write about them, and other cultures, they record them, but in a very different way. But I'm open to studying the interchange and any parallels that I could find there. I also don't have the expertise in those languages, so it sort of was an initial setback.
And just for my own part, I mean, I've dug around in this to some small extent, but if we're looking backwards in time towards something like the late Bronze Age, it's really informative to look at sort of precursors to Apollo as, the bow-bearing disease of plague. So this is thick on the ground, both within Assyriological sources as well as Egyptian sources. So it would be highly informative to not really, engage in this question of priority of influence, right? Or the Greeks just sort of taking up a potted god and fitting it to their own sources, but to the interactivity and the creativity of ancient polytheisms as they are crucial vehicles for transmitting kinds of medical ideas, right, in the ancient Mediterranean, beginning from this really globalized world of the late Bronze Age, as it then trickles down into our classical sources. So not just looking at, the context of Homeric epic as a part of a wider Mediterranean tradition, but also medical ideas as part of a wider Mediterranean edition, and the way that those ideas are taken up and adapted to fit specific sources or specific needs at specific times. So your emphasis on that, we need to look beyond Greece and Rome is really crucial, and I think now more than any time before. So these really global perspectives are really welcome, and thank you for bringing that in. We have lots of questions now, so I will take one from William McGrath. So he's thanking us all for our presentations and would like to ask me about the relationship between humoral and miasmatic etiologies in the sources that I surveyed. And would I say that the etiologies remain mutually exclusive, or were Greek scholars and physicians able to reconcile the two systems? The short answer is not really. So Galen kind of tries to, but he doesn't try very hard. So Galen, the sort of famous physician in the 2nd century CE, and that's kind of problematic for him. And he never represents it as such, but he never represents anything as problematic for him. So the one of the texts that I talked about, that is The Nature of the Human Being, which gives us the sort of 4 canonical humors, is really sort of like one of Galen's template for what a Hippocratic text is, right? So Galen's engaged in this project of sort of sorting out what are and what are not the authentic Hippocratic texts. So it's not just a project of ours. And On the Nature of the Human Being is one of them, and is one of the only, right, that talk about epidemic diseases as a separate class of disease. So he engages in this taxonomical enterprise of sorting out the humoral diseases, or the ones that are based on individual constitutions, and then the ones that like manifestly, just empirically, obviously are attacking everybody in the community. So it can't be a matter of just like you didn't eat the proper balance of stuff with the proper balance of exercise. So he then points to the common denominator of what everybody shares, and it's got to be the air, right? So he says the air is the most common thing, so therefore it's these bad airs that are making us sick. Galen kind of takes that and a blend of the ideas that are presented in On Breaths, which really gives us the more kind of quasi-detailed account of the production of miasmatic airs, these things that might actually have a material substance that gets you sick. But Breaths is a really problematic text in and of itself because it's highly rhetorical. It's not clear that it's even written by a doctor at all. It's just interested in making kind of outlandish arguments to prove that all human disease is caused by air. But basically, Galen looks to the combination of these two arguments and is able to sort of produce the notion that with a Lucretian addition, that their sperma, or their seeds of corruption within the air, and that can trigger a cascade of disease within the body. But it's really not until like the 16th century or a little earlier with Fra Castaro that something like actual contagion through particles is really articulated in the Greek tradition. So humoral theory kind of takes over the reins, and there's never a really concerted effort to reconcile the two traditions. So let's see. Stephen Hill wants to know, are there any documented instances whereby ancient Greeks or Romans considered corrupted water as a possible source of human disease, possibly water targeted by the gods to exact their wrath? It's an interesting question. I'm going to open it up to us all.
Well, in the Noric plague that Virgil describes, which of course is largely fictive, but some people have argued it was an actual plague. He does describe there's like tabum. He describes an atmosphere of miasma, but then something gets into the lacus, into the water, the shared water spaces of these animals, and it is suggested that that's one of the ways that there's a sort of a transmission from the water into the bodies of the cattle. But again, Virgil's etiology and symptomatology is very imprecise. It's very poetic. So yeah, I think the air seems to be more commonly posited as the source of the disease in the accounts that that I've come across. Although, you know, Ovid's account too does mention, you know, poisoned water supplies. So, and there's isn't there the story that circulates in Thucydides' text that the Spartans had poisoned the wells of the Athenians. So, I mean, it was certainly on the minds of people as a possible source.
Yeah, that's reproduced too in the Hippocratic letters, where the Hippocratic family are sort of smuggled into the first sacred war, and they poison the enemy's water supply with hellebore, the sort of like most famous Hippocratic ingredient, the cure-all, and also terribly lethal. Kyle, Roman water supplies, I mean, we've got this huge public water system, right?
Right. No, I mean, the examples you've thought of are great. And there's obviously the tradition that kind of goes back to airs, waters, and places that like swampy landscapes are dangerous, which probably reflects mosquito breeding, which probably stirs kind of malarial environments. And then there's some sense of the importance of clean water. But other than the examples you've mentioned, I can't really think of connections with epidemic mortality, although waterborne diseases must have been kind of one of the main variable volatile diseases that that could really cause localized epidemics like outbreaks of shigellosis. So the water, even in Rome, where the aqueducts do supply clean drinking water, water would have been really important. But I was struggling to think of good examples beyond the ones that you all came up with. That's great.
Well, I think that's all the time that we have for this evening. So I think we're going to wrap it up by thanking again both Kyle Harper and Hunter Gardner for taking the time to help lead this really insightful panel. Thank you so much. And thanking you all again for coming out and spending some of your evening with us. I hope you still all have appetites for dinner, as you know, I don't know if I do. I hope to do something like this with you all again, and thank you to the NYU Center for Ancient Studies and Matthew Santarocco and Mara Pollard for organizing this.
Yeah, thanks, Callaway, for moderating, and yeah, it's good to see you both.
Yeah, likewise. All right, take care, everybody. Stay healthy.